The most miserable marriages in history, a relaxing journey through history's unhappiest couples. Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow and rather uncomfortable stroll through some of the most miserable marriages in history. Now, marriage is supposed to be one of life's happier arrangements. At least that's the theory. Two people meet. They fall in love. They promise to support each other through good times and bad. They build a life together. Simple. Unfortunately, history had other ideas. Because for thousands of years, marriage was often less about romance and more about politics, money, power, inheritance, diplomacy, military alliances, and occasionally preventing entire kingdoms from collapsing. Love was sometimes involved. Sometimes. But not always. And when love was absent, things could become remarkably unpleasant. Tonight, we'll meet kings who despised their queens, queens who plotted against their husbands, emperors trapped in political unions, and couples whose marriages helped drag entire nations into chaos. So dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair, and prepare to drift through centuries of royal arguments, political disasters, family feuds, and some truly astonishing relationship decisions. Because if you've ever thought your own dating history was complicated, history would like a word. Specifically, Chapter 1. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, when a marriage changed a religion. When people hear the name Henry VIII, they usually remember one thing: the wives. The unfortunate pattern involving wives. But before all that happened, Henry actually began with what seemed like a fairly promising marriage. The year was 1509. Young Henry VIII had recently become King of England. He was athletic, charismatic, intelligent, and popular. At least for the moment. Standing beside him was Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was not merely a princess. She was one of the most respected women in Europe. The daughter of the powerful rulers Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Catherine had been educated to an extraordinary level for the period. She spoke multiple languages. She understood politics. She possessed dignity, intelligence, and strong religious convictions. In many ways she was better prepared for leadership than most male rulers of her era. Initially, the marriage appeared successful. They genuinely respected one another. For years they worked together as partners. When Henry went to France on military campaigns, Catherine even served as regent. At one point she successfully helped organize England's defense against the Scottish invasion. Not exactly the behavior people expected from a decorative queen. The problem, unfortunately, was succession. Royal marriages were judged by one question: could they produce an heir? And preferably a male heir. Catherine became pregnant multiple times. Most pregnancies ended in tragedy. Infants died. Children failed to survive. Only one child lived to adulthood. A daughter. The future Queen Mary I. Henry became increasingly obsessed with the lack of a surviving son. Now, from a modern perspective, this seems rather unfair. Catherine had done everything expected of her. But medieval and early modern monarchies were deeply concerned about succession crises. Civil wars could erupt when heirs were uncertain. Henry convinced himself that their marriage was somehow cursed. More specifically, he began searching for religious reasons why God might be punishing him. Conveniently, around the same time, he became fascinated with a young woman named Anne Boleyn. History has a remarkable ability to produce suspicious coincidences. Henry requested an annulment from the Pope. Catherine refused to cooperate. She insisted that their marriage was legitimate. Because, inconveniently for Henry, it was. Years of legal arguments followed. Europe watched. Diplomats argued. Church officials debated. Catherine stood firm. Henry grew increasingly frustrated. Eventually he chose an option that would permanently reshape European history. If the Pope would not grant an annulment, then perhaps England needed less Pope. The result was the English Reformation. A personal marital dispute transformed into a religious revolution. The Church of England emerged. Centuries of religious conflict followed. Entire political systems changed. All because one king desperately wanted a different marriage. Catherine spent her final years isolated from court. She never accepted the annulment. She continued calling herself the rightful queen until her death. Henry rarely saw her again. After more than 2 decades together, their marriage ended in bitterness and separation. And the consequences would echo across Europe for generations. Not bad for what started as a family disagreement. Chapter 2. Ivan the Terrible and Anastasia, Love, Loss, and Paranoia. Not every miserable marriage began badly. Some became tragic because they began well. Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, offers a fascinating example. As a child, Ivan endured extraordinary trauma. His parents died when he was young. Powerful nobles manipulated and abused him. Violence surrounded his upbringing. Trust became difficult. Understandably. When Ivan married Anastasia Romanovna in 1547, something unusual happened. He seemed genuinely happy. Contemporary accounts describe Anastasia as calm, intelligent, and compassionate. She reportedly helped moderate Ivan's darker tendencies. For years the marriage appeared stable. Which is not something historians often get to say about Ivan the Terrible. Anastasia provided emotional support and political stability. She became one of the few people Ivan genuinely trusted. Then she died unexpectedly in 1560. And everything changed. Ivan became convinced she had been poisoned. Modern historians still debate the cause of death. But Ivan never doubted. In his mind, powerful enemies had murdered his beloved wife. His grief evolved into paranoia. His paranoia evolved into terror. His terror evolved into one of the most infamous reigns in Russian history. Executions multiplied. Purges expanded. Suspected enemies vanished. Entire noble families suffered. Ivan's later marriages were far less successful. Many involved political calculations rather than affection. None provided the stability Anastasia had once offered. In a strange way, this is one of history's saddest marital stories. Not because the marriage itself was miserable, but because losing it made everything afterward miserable. For Ivan, for his court, and unfortunately for countless other people. Chapter 3. George IV and Caroline of Brunswick, a royal disaster from day one. Some marriages collapse gradually. Others collapse immediately. The marriage of George IV and Caroline of Brunswick belongs firmly in the second category. When George first met Caroline in 1795, expectations were high. Britain needed a politically useful marriage. Caroline seemed suitable. Then they met. Accounts differ regarding exactly what happened. What everyone agrees on is that neither was impressed. George reportedly complained about her appearance. Caroline reportedly found him unpleasant. The future king was heavily in debt, spoiled, self-indulgent, and accustomed to getting his way. Caroline was independent, outspoken, and not particularly interested in pretending otherwise. Not exactly a recipe for harmony. The wedding proceeded anyway. Because royal marriages rarely asked whether participants actually liked each other. According to several accounts, George drank heavily before the ceremony, which is generally not a promising sign. The couple produced one child, Princess Charlotte. Afterward they effectively separated. And then things became astonishingly public. Both sides accused the other of misconduct. Newspapers covered every development. Political factions took sides. Rumors spread constantly. Caroline traveled throughout Europe. George attempted repeatedly to exclude her from royal life. When George eventually became king, he even tried to prevent Caroline from being crowned queen. Imagine having a disagreement with your spouse and responding by reorganizing a national ceremony. That is commitment to a grudge. When Caroline died in 1821, public sympathy largely favored her. George remained unpopular for much of his reign. Their marriage had become one of the most famous public disasters in British history. And they had barely managed to tolerate each other from the beginning. #the most miserable marriages in history. Part 2, when royal weddings became lifetime sentences. Hey guys, welcome back. Last time, we met several couples whose marriages ranged from deeply unhappy to historically catastrophic. We watched Henry VIII transform a marital dispute into a religious revolution. We saw Ivan the Terrible lose the one person who seemed capable of calming him. And we witnessed George IV and Caroline of Brunswick turn a royal marriage into a public feud that lasted decades. Tonight, our journey continues. And unfortunately for the people involved, things are not about to become more romantic. Because history is filled with rulers who discovered that sharing a throne did not necessarily mean sharing affection. Sometimes it barely meant sharing the same building. So settle in, relax, and let's continue our exploration of history's most miserable marriages. Chapter 4. Napoleon and Josephine, the emperor who could conquer Europe but not his marriage. There was a time when Napoleon Bonaparte was desperately in love. This may sound surprising. Most people imagine Napoleon standing on battlefields, pointing dramatically toward distant horizons, while armies marched and cannons fired. But before he became emperor, he was simply a young military officer hopelessly infatuated with a woman named Josephine. And when Napoleon fell in love, he fell hard. His letters to Josephine were famously emotional. Sometimes overwhelmingly emotional. While Napoleon was away fighting military campaigns, he wrote constant messages expressing affection and longing. Unfortunately, Josephine often seemed considerably less enthusiastic, which is one of history's recurring themes. One spouse writes passionate letters. The other remembers to reply 3 weeks later. Their marriage began in 1796. At first, Napoleon adored her. But problems emerged quickly. There were rumors of infidelity. There were long separations. There were periods of distrust. And there was one particularly enormous problem. The couple could not produce an heir. Now, for ordinary people, this would have been a private disappointment. For an emperor attempting to build a dynasty that would dominate Europe, it became a political crisis. Napoleon's power depended partly on creating a stable future for his empire. Without a legitimate heir, everything seemed uncertain. As years passed, the pressure increased. Napoleon still cared deeply about Josephine. But political realities became impossible to ignore. In 1809, he made a painful decision. The marriage would end. The divorce ceremony was surprisingly emotional. Both Napoleon and Josephine reportedly wept, which is not usually how people imagine one of history's greatest conquerors spending an evening. Napoleon later married Marie-Louise of Austria. The new marriage successfully produced a son. Politically, it achieved exactly what Napoleon wanted. Personally, however, many historians believe Josephine remained a great love of his life. Even after their separation, he continued supporting her financially. He maintained contact. And according to some accounts, her name was among the last words he spoke before his death. For a man who conquered much of Europe, losing Josephine may have remained one of his greatest personal defeats. Chapter 5. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, two lonely people in a palace. When people think about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they usually think about the French Revolution, the angry crowds, the political chaos, the downfall of the monarchy. But long before those events unfolded, there was a marriage that struggled from the beginning. Louis and Marie Antoinette married in 1770. Both were teenagers. Neither had much control over the arrangement. The marriage was designed to strengthen relations between France and Austria. In other words, politics had once again decided who would spend the rest of their lives together. The young couple entered one of the most intimidating environments in Europe, the Palace of Versailles. Versailles was magnificent. It was also exhausting. Thousands of nobles constantly observed every movement. Privacy barely existed. Simple activities became elaborate public ceremonies. Imagine trying to learn how to be married while several hundred aristocrats watched. Not ideal. Louis was shy and awkward. Marie Antoinette was young, energetic, and eager for entertainment. Their personalities often failed to connect. For years, the marriage remained unusually distant. European diplomats became obsessed with discussing the situation. Reports traveled across the continent. Foreign governments monitored developments. Everyone wanted to know when the royal couple would produce children. The pressure became enormous. Eventually, they did have children. But by then, public opinion had already begun turning against Marie Antoinette. She became a target for rumors. Many accusations were wildly exaggerated or entirely false. Unfortunately, truth has never been a strict requirement for gossip. As revolutionary tensions increased, the royal family became increasingly isolated. Louis and Marie Antoinette found themselves trapped by circumstances larger than either of them could control. Ironically, the greatest closeness in their marriage may have emerged during their final years. Facing common dangers often creates unexpected bonds. As revolution intensified, they relied more heavily on each other. By then, however, events had moved beyond their control. The monarchy collapsed. The revolution accelerated. And one of history's most famous royal marriages ended amid national upheaval. Their story remains tragic partly because they were never entirely villains or heroes. They were simply two imperfect people trying, and often failing, to navigate extraordinary circumstances. Chapter 6. Emperor Claudius and Messalina, ancient Rome's most chaotic marriage. Ancient Rome rarely disappointed when it came to scandal. and few marriages generated more scandal than that of Emperor Claudius and Valeria Messalina. Claudius became emperor unexpectedly. Many people underestimated him. Some believed he lacked the qualities needed to rule. They turned out to be mistaken. Claudius proved more capable than his critics expected. His marriage, however, proved considerably less successful. Messalina quickly developed a reputation that fascinated ancient historians. Now, it's important to remember that Roman sources often exaggerated stories, especially about powerful women. Ancient writers loved dramatic scandals. Sometimes perhaps a little too much. Nevertheless, even after allowing for exaggeration, the relationship appears deeply troubled. Claudius often seemed unaware of plots developing around him. Messalina allegedly became involved in political intrigues, rivalries, and power struggles. Enemies disappeared. Accusations multiplied. The imperial court became increasingly unstable. Eventually, matters reached a breaking point. Messalina was accused of effectively attempting to replace the emperor. Claudius was informed that his own position might be under threat. This is generally the sort of news that concerns people. Roman officials moved quickly. Messalina was removed from power. Her downfall became one of the most famous scandals of the Roman Empire. Claudius survived politically. Emotionally, however, the situation left lasting damage. According to some accounts, he later declared he would never marry again. History, being history, ignored his wishes. He married again. That marriage would also create problems. Because apparently the Roman imperial palace believed peace and stability were overrated. Chapter 7. Peter the Great and Eudoxia, a marriage left behind by history. Few rulers transformed their country as dramatically as Peter the Great. Peter wanted Russia to modernize. He wanted new technology, new institutions, new ideas, new connections with Europe. Essentially, Peter looked at Russia and decided it needed a complete renovation. His wife, Eudoxia Lapakina, represented a more traditional world. Their marriage had been arranged when both were young. Initially, it fulfilled political expectations. But as Peter's ambitions expanded, the couple grew increasingly distant. Peter became fascinated by Western Europe. He traveled abroad. He studied shipbuilding. He reorganized government institutions. He built new cities. He rarely seemed interested in spending time with his wife. Eudoxia found herself increasingly isolated. Eventually Peter effectively ended the marriage. She was sent away from court and spent years separated from political life. Meanwhile, Peter pursued his reforms and formed new relationships. From Peter's perspective, the marriage belonged to an older Russia he was trying to leave behind. From Eudoxia's perspective, she had been abandoned by a husband who no longer valued her place in his life. The marriage became another example of how personal relationships often suffer when rulers become consumed by grand ambitions. History remembers Peter as a transformative leader. Eudoxia is remembered largely as someone caught in the path of transformation. And unfortunately, history rarely asks whether the people being transformed actually wanted the experience. The most miserable marriages in history. Part 3, Betrayal, Isolation, and Royal Revenge. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're continuing our long journey through some of history's most unhappy marriages. So far we've encountered emperors, kings, queens, and rulers who discovered that sharing a crown did not guarantee happiness. In fact, it often seemed to guarantee the exact opposite. Because royal marriages were rarely built on love. They were contracts, diplomatic agreements, political bargains. Sometimes they were essentially international treaties disguised as weddings. And as we'll discover tonight, forcing two powerful people into a marriage for political reasons could produce consequences ranging from uncomfortable to catastrophic. So get comfortable, relax, and let's return to the palaces, castles, and royal courts where some of history's most miserable relationships unfolded. Chapter 8. Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, the Lonely Empress. Among Europe's most famous royal couples, few appeared more glamorous than Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria and his wife, Elizabeth, better known as Sisi. At first glance, their story seems romantic. Franz Joseph fell in love with Elizabeth almost immediately. This was unusual. Royal marriages were often arranged by families. Yet the young emperor genuinely wanted to marry her. For once, it appeared that love had actually entered the equation. History, however, rarely allows things to remain simple. Elizabeth was only 16 years old when she entered the Austrian court. She had grown up in a relatively relaxed environment. The imperial court of Vienna was something entirely different. Every action followed strict rules. Every appearance was carefully managed. Every word was monitored. Life became a never-ending performance. And Elizabeth hated it. Almost immediately she felt trapped. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, exercised enormous influence over court life. The relationship between the two women quickly became strained. Sophie believed she knew best. Elizabeth strongly disagreed. Anyone who has ever dealt with an overbearing family member can probably sympathize. Although perhaps not on an imperial scale. The pressure affected Elizabeth deeply. She struggled with court expectations. She became increasingly withdrawn. Travel became her escape. Whenever possible, she left Vienna. She visited distant regions of the empire. She spent long periods away from her husband. Franz Joseph genuinely loved her. That much appears clear. But love alone could not solve their problems. The emperor remained tied to government duties. Elizabeth increasingly withdrew into her own world. Years passed. The distance between them grew. They remained married. They remained loyal. But they often lived separate lives. One of the saddest aspects of their story is that neither appears to have wanted the marriage to become unhappy. Yet circumstances, expectations, and emotional isolation slowly transformed what had begun as a love story into something far lonelier. When Elizabeth was assassinated in 1898, Franz Joseph was devastated. By then they had spent decades drifting apart and reconnecting. Loving each other and misunderstanding each other. Remaining together while living increasingly separate lives. Their marriage was not defined by hatred. It was defined by loneliness. And sometimes loneliness can be just as tragic. Chapter 9. Edward II and Isabella of France, when a queen declared war on her husband. Not all unhappy marriages end quietly. Some end with invasions. The marriage of Edward II of England and Isabella of France belongs firmly in that category. Edward and Isabella married in 1308. Initially, expectations were high. England and France hoped the union would strengthen political ties. Instead, It created one of medieval Europe's most dramatic conflicts. Edward II possessed many qualities. Diplomatic skill was not always among them. Neither was relationship management. Soon after the marriage, tensions emerged. Edward's close relationships with several male favorites caused political controversy. Many nobles resented the influence these men held at court. Isabella found herself increasingly marginalized. For years she attempted to fulfill her role as queen. She produced heirs. She participated in diplomatic affairs. She tried to navigate a difficult political environment. But her position steadily weakened. Eventually Isabella reached her limit. And when medieval queens reached their limit, interesting things sometimes happened. In 1325 she traveled to France. Officially, this was a diplomatic mission. Unofficially, it became something much more significant. While abroad, Isabella refused to return to England. She formed alliances with Edward's enemies. Most notably, she joined forces with Roger Mortimer. Together they organized an invasion. Imagine explaining this situation to a marriage counselor. "My wife has left the country." That's unfortunate. She has also assembled an army. Oh. The invasion succeeded. Edward's supporters collapsed. The king lost power. Eventually he was removed from the throne. Their son became king as Edward III. For a time, Isabella effectively ruled England alongside Mortimer. Her marriage had evolved from an unhappy relationship into a political revolution. Few royal disagreements have escalated quite so dramatically. Chapter 10. George I and Sophia Dorothea, the marriage that ended in imprisonment. If history awarded prizes for miserable marriages, George I and Sophia Dorothea would certainly deserve consideration. Their marriage began badly. It remained bad. And somehow managed to become even worse. George, the future king of Great Britain, married Sophia Dorothea in 1682. The match made political sense. Unfortunately, political sense and personal happiness are not the same thing. The couple disliked each other almost immediately. George openly maintained relationships with mistresses. Sophia Dorothea felt neglected and isolated. Arguments became common. Resentment deepened. The atmosphere grew increasingly toxic. Then matters took a dramatic turn. Sophia Dorothea developed a close relationship with a Swedish nobleman named Count Philip Christoph von Königsmark. Rumors spread rapidly. Letters circulated. Court gossip exploded. Eventually Königsmark disappeared. Completely. No confirmed explanation ever emerged. Historians continue debating exactly what happened. What everyone agrees upon is that he vanished under highly suspicious circumstances. Sophia Dorothea paid an enormous price. Her marriage was dissolved. She was separated from her children. She spent the remainder of her life in confinement. For more than 30 years. Think about that. More than 3 decades. She never saw her children again. Meanwhile, George continued his political career and eventually became king. Their marriage ended not merely in separation but in lifelong punishment. It remains one of the harshest marital outcomes in European royal history. Chapter 11. Philip II of Spain and Mary I, a marriage nobody wanted. Sometimes a marriage can be miserable even when neither spouse is particularly cruel. The marriage of Mary I of England and Philip II of Spain demonstrates this perfectly. Mary became queen in 1553. She faced enormous political challenges. She also desperately wanted stability, and ideally an heir. Philip of Spain seemed like a powerful ally. The marriage was arranged. The public reaction was not enthusiastic. In fact, many English subjects strongly opposed it. They feared foreign influence. They worried Spain would dominate English affairs. Suspicion spread throughout the kingdom. Mary genuinely cared for Philip. Philip appears to have viewed the marriage primarily as a political alliance. This imbalance created difficulties from the beginning. The queen hoped for affection. The king sought strategic advantages. Not exactly a perfect match. Then came a heartbreaking development. Mary believed she was pregnant. The entire kingdom prepared for the arrival of an heir. Months passed. No child appeared. Modern historians believe this was likely a false pregnancy. The emotional impact was devastating. Mary experienced hope, anticipation, and ultimately disappointment. Philip spent long periods abroad. The couple often lived apart. Their relationship never developed the closeness Mary desired. When Mary died in 1558, Philip proposed marriage to her successor, Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth declined. Quite firmly. Which probably tells us something about the reputation of the arrangement. Chapter 12. Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine, the couple who could never agree. Long before Henry VIII created marital chaos, medieval Europe already possessed experts in the field. One of the most famous examples was Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was extraordinary. Intelligent. Independent. Charismatic. One of the wealthiest women in Europe. Louis was pious, serious, and deeply religious. At first glance, they seemed very different. And over time, those differences became impossible to ignore. The couple participated in the Second Crusade together. Instead of strengthening the marriage, the experience exposed their incompatibility. Arguments increased. Mutual frustration grew. Eventually the marriage was annulled. This would have been notable enough on its own. But Eleanor then married one of Louis's greatest rivals. The future King of England, Henry II. Which was roughly the medieval equivalent of ending a relationship and immediately marrying your former spouse's biggest competitor. The political consequences were enormous. Through Eleanor, vast territories shifted into English control. French kings would spend generations dealing with the consequences. Louis lost both a wife and a significant strategic advantage. A remarkably efficient defeat. The most miserable marriages in history. Part 4: Empires, Resentment, and the Couples Who Changed History. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're continuing our slow journey through history's most unhappy marriages. So far we've seen couples trapped by politics, separated by ambition, and occasionally attempting to solve marital disagreements by overthrowing governments. Which, admittedly, is a fairly dramatic approach to relationship problems. But tonight we enter an even stranger territory. Because some of the marriages we're discussing didn't merely affect the people involved. They helped shape the destinies of entire empires. The arguments, resentments, misunderstandings, and disappointments of a few individuals would eventually influence millions of lives. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's continue. Chapter 13, Catherine the Great and Peter III, a marriage destined for disaster. Some marriages are doomed from the beginning. The marriage between the future Catherine the Great and Peter III of Russia is one of history's clearest examples. When Catherine first arrived in Russia as a young German princess, she quickly realized something important. Her future husband was unusual, and not necessarily in a good way. Peter was immature, unpredictable, and often seemed more interested in toy soldiers than governing an empire. Now, enjoying hobbies is perfectly reasonable. But when your hobby involves treating military dolls with greater seriousness than state affairs, people begin to notice. Catherine, by contrast, was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply interested in politics. She worked tirelessly to learn Russian customs. She studied the language. She cultivated allies. She observed how power functioned. While Peter often appeared determined to make himself unpopular, Catherine quietly prepared herself for leadership. Their marriage quickly deteriorated. Both partners became frustrated. Both sought companionship elsewhere. Neither seemed to possess much affection for the other. Years passed in an atmosphere of mutual resentment. When Peter eventually became emperor in 1762, matters only worsened. His decisions alienated nobles, military officers, and political leaders. Support for Catherine grew rapidly. Then came one of the most dramatic marital endings in history. A coup. Catherine's supporters moved against Peter. The emperor was removed from power. Soon afterward, he died under mysterious circumstances. Historians still debate exactly what happened. What is certain is that Catherine emerged victorious. She became one of Russia's most successful rulers. Peter became a historical footnote. Few marriages have ended with one spouse becoming one of history's most famous monarchs while the other disappears into obscurity. It was less a divorce and more a complete transfer of an empire. Chapter 14. Nicholas II and Alexandra, Love in a World Falling Apart. Not every unhappy marriage was unhappy because the couple disliked each other. Sometimes the tragedy came from loving each other too much. The marriage of the last Russian emperor, Nicholas II, and his wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, illustrates this perfectly. Unlike many royal couples, Nicholas and Alexandra genuinely loved one another. Their letters reveal affection, devotion, and emotional closeness. For once, history had produced a royal marriage built on real feeling. Unfortunately, they happened to be ruling an empire that was slowly collapsing. Russia entered the 20th century facing enormous challenges. Economic problems, political unrest, social tensions, military defeats, revolutionary movements, and, as if that weren't enough, constant pressure on the imperial family. Alexandra became increasingly isolated. She struggled to connect with Russian society. Many people viewed her with suspicion because of her German origins. Rumors spread constantly. Every decision faced criticism. Then came another devastating challenge. Their son, Alexei, suffered from a serious medical condition. The family lived in constant fear for his health. Desperation led them toward the mysterious figure known as Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's influence generated enormous controversy. Public confidence in the monarchy declined further. Meanwhile, Nicholas remained deeply devoted to his wife. Perhaps too devoted. Many advisors worried that personal loyalty sometimes outweighed political judgment. As the First World War intensified, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The empire approached crisis. Yet Nicholas and Alexandra increasingly withdrew into their family circle. The result was tragic. They loved each other sincerely, but their isolation prevented them from understanding how dramatically circumstances had changed outside palace walls. When revolution finally arrived, neither was prepared. Their marriage remained strong. Their empire did not. Sometimes history's saddest stories are not about hatred. They're about devotion that cannot overcome larger forces. Chapter 15. Emperor Nero and Octavia, a marriage of convenience. Ancient Rome returns to our story once again. Because whenever historians discuss unhappy relationships, Rome usually insists on participating. Nero married Octavia when both were young. The arrangement strengthened political alliances within the imperial family. Love, as usual, was not the central consideration. Initially, Octavia fulfilled her role without controversy. She was respected, popular, and generally avoided creating problems. Unfortunately, her husband was Nero. Over time, Nero became increasingly interested in another woman, Poppaea Sabina. This complicated matters. For Octavia, especially. The emperor eventually decided that he no longer wanted his marriage. Accusations emerged. Political justifications appeared. Roman officials found convenient reasons to support the emperor's wishes. Octavia was removed from public life. Many ordinary Romans sympathized with her. Public support became so strong that it reportedly worried Nero. And when a ruler becomes concerned about public sympathy for a former spouse, history rarely heads toward a cheerful conclusion. Octavia's fate became one of the darker episodes of Nero's reign. Her story illustrates how vulnerable even high-ranking individuals could be when imperial politics turned against them. Being married to an emperor might sound glamorous. In practice, it often proved remarkably dangerous. Chapter 16. King John and Isabella of Angoulême, a marriage surrounded by conflict. King John of England already possessed a difficult reputation. The famous Magna Carta emerged largely because many people found him challenging to work with. That is perhaps the most diplomatic way to phrase it. His marriage to Isabella of Angoulême added further complications. The union created political advantages. It also created enemies. Because Isabella had previously been promised to another nobleman, the resulting resentment contributed to wider conflicts. John's reign became marked by disputes, military failures, and political instability. His marriage did little to improve matters. Although Isabella was intelligent and influential, the relationship unfolded amid constant crises. Wars erupted. Territories were lost. Nobles rebelled. Trust evaporated. By the time John's reign ended, England faced profound uncertainty. The marriage itself was only one part of a larger story. Yet it demonstrates how royal relationships often became entangled with political struggles. When rulers married, entire nations sometimes inherited the consequences. Chapter 17. The Tragedy of Charles and Diana. As we move closer to modern history, we encounter perhaps one of the most famous unhappy marriages ever recorded. The marriage of Charles III and Diana Spencer. Unlike many earlier examples, this story unfolded under intense media attention. Millions of people watched. Millions formed opinions. Millions followed every development. Their wedding in 1981 seemed like a fairy tale. crowds celebrated. Television audiences reached extraordinary numbers. The world appeared captivated. Yet behind the spectacle, difficulties already existed. The couple differed significantly in age, personality, and expectations. Media scrutiny became relentless. Every gesture attracted analysis. Every disagreement inspired headlines. Over time, the emotional distance between them widened. Public appearances continued. Private tensions increased. Eventually, the marriage broke down. The separation became global news. So did the divorce. The tragedy of their relationship fascinated people because it felt surprisingly human. Despite the palaces, titles, and ceremonies, many observers recognized familiar problems. Miscommunication, different expectations, emotional isolation, public pressure. The scale was extraordinary. The emotions were not. Closing thoughts. As we finish tonight's chapter, a pattern emerges. Many of history's most miserable marriages were not destroyed by a single event. Instead, they slowly eroded. Expectations collided with reality. Politics overwhelmed affection. Power complicated trust. And people discovered that wealth, titles, armies, and crowns could not guarantee happiness. If anything, they sometimes made happiness even harder to find. The most miserable marriages in history. Part 5. The couples who turned love into war. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're continuing our long, slow journey through history's most unhappy marriages. At this point, we've seen enough royal relationships to notice a pattern. When ordinary people have marital problems, they might argue in the kitchen. When kings and queens have marital problems, entire countries somehow become involved. Taxes change. Armies move. Diplomats panic. And historians gain material for centuries. Tonight we'll meet couples whose marriages didn't merely fail. They exploded. And when powerful people explode, the consequences tend to travel far beyond palace walls. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's continue. Chapter 18. Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, the marriage that created a dynasty and nearly destroyed it. Few couples in medieval Europe were as powerful as King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Individually, they were remarkable. Together, they controlled vast territories stretching across much of Western Europe. On paper, it looked like the perfect political partnership. In reality, it became one of the most turbulent marriages in history. Eleanor was intelligent, charismatic, wealthy, and politically experienced. Henry was energetic, ambitious, and determined to expand his authority. At first, the partnership worked. They had numerous children. They built an empire. They appeared unstoppable. But two ambitious people do not always enjoy sharing power. As years passed, tensions emerged. Henry expected obedience. Eleanor expected influence. Neither was particularly willing to surrender their position. Then came another complication. Henry developed relationships with other women. Quite openly. This did not improve the marriage. To everyone's surprise, Eleanor eventually supported her sons when they rebelled against their father. Think about that for a moment. A queen actively assisting her own children in opposition to the king. Family gatherings must have been fascinating. The rebellion failed. Henry emerged victorious. Eleanor paid a heavy price. For years she lived under varying degrees of confinement. Although technically still queen, her freedom became severely restricted. Their marriage never recovered. Yet the strange thing is that both remained enormously important. Their children would shape European history for generations. Among them were figures such as Richard I and John. The marriage failed. The dynasty endured. History often works that way. Chapter 19. Richard II and End of Bohemia, happiness interrupted by tragedy. After so many unhappy marriages, it's worth pausing for a relationship that actually seems to have contained genuine affection. Not because it ended happily, but because its ending created misery. King Richard II married Anne of Bohemia in 1382. Initially, many English nobles disliked the match. The alliance offered fewer political advantages than expected. Critics complained. Commentators grumbled, as commentators have done throughout history. Yet Richard and Anne appear to have developed real affection for one another. Contemporary accounts suggest a surprisingly warm relationship, and often acted as a calming influence. She encouraged reconciliation. She intervened on behalf of people seeking mercy. For a time, the marriage seemed unusually successful. Then disaster struck. Anne died suddenly during an epidemic in 1394. Richard was devastated. According to several accounts, his grief became overwhelming. The palace where she died was reportedly demolished because he could not bear the memory. Whether every detail is accurate or not, the emotional impact is clear. Richard never fully recovered. His reign became increasingly unstable afterward. Political conflicts intensified. Support weakened. Eventually he lost his throne. It's impossible to know exactly how events might have unfolded had Anne survived. But many historians believe her death removed one of the few stabilizing influences in Richard's life. Sometimes the most miserable marriages are not the ones filled with conflict. Sometimes they're the ones cut short by loss. Chapter 20. Philip IV and Joan of Navarre, suspicion at the heart of power. King Philip IV of France was known for many things. Warmth and friendliness were not usually among them. He was intelligent, calculating, and intensely focused on authority. His marriage to Joan of Navarre was politically successful. Together they expanded influence and strengthened royal power. Yet the atmosphere surrounding the French court often felt tense. Philip trusted few people. He governed through discipline and control. His family became deeply entangled in political scandals. Most famously, accusations later emerged involving several royal daughters-in-law. The resulting investigations damaged the reputation of the royal family. Although Joan herself generally escaped the worst controversies, the environment surrounding the marriage reflected a broader problem. Life at court increasingly revolved around suspicion. And suspicion is rarely healthy for any relationship. Whether in a medieval palace or a modern apartment, the scale simply changes. Chapter 21. Ivan the Terrible's later marriages, searching for stability and finding none. Earlier we discussed Ivan the Terrible and his beloved first wife, Anastasia. Tonight we return to Ivan. Because after Anastasia's death, his marital history became increasingly chaotic. Ivan married multiple times afterward. Each marriage appeared to begin with hope. Each eventually encountered difficulties. Some wives died unexpectedly. Others were removed from court. political concerns constantly influenced personal decisions. Meanwhile, Ivan's own mental and emotional state deteriorated. Paranoia increased. Trust disappeared. Fear dominated decision-making. The tragedy is obvious. The stability he had once enjoyed vanished, and no subsequent marriage managed to replace it. For Ivan, every new relationship seems to have reminded him of what he had lost. History remembers him as a powerful ruler, but power offered little protection against grief. Chapter 22. The marriage of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. If two people can spend decades married while barely appearing to enjoy each other's company, Louis XIII of France and Anne of Austria deserve recognition. Their marriage began in 1615. Both were young. Both were members of powerful royal families. Both faced enormous expectations. The problem was that they struggled to connect. Louis was reserved and cautious, and was lively and sociable. Misunderstandings emerged almost immediately. Years passed without producing an heir. This became a major political concern. Courtiers speculated endlessly. Rumors spread through Europe. Diplomats monitored developments. The marriage of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, they appeared unstoppable, but complicated. But two ambitious people do not always enjoy sharing power. This entry may seem surprising. As years passed, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert are usually remembered as a loving couple, and Eleanor expected influence. But that doesn't mean the marriage was willing to surrender their position. Victoria loved Albert deeply. Then came another complication. Albert loved Victoria. Henry developed relationships with other women. From power. Quite openly, Victoria was queen. This did not improve Albert the marriage. Was not king. To everyone's created awkward situations. Eleanor eventually supported her sons when they rebelled against their ambition. Think about constitutional realities limited his authority. Queen actively assisting her own children in opposition to define his role. Family gatherings must have been fascinating. Arguments occurred. The rebellion failed. Responsibilities emerged victorious. And yet, Eleanor paid a heavy price. Series, they managed to navigate those challenges varying degrees of confinement. The reason this chapter matters is because it highlights something important. Became severely restricted. Even successful marriages never recovered power. Yet the strange thing is that both do not eliminate difficulties. Their children would shape European history for generations. When Albert died in 1861, among them were figures Victoria such as Richard I and John. Period of mourning. The marriage failed. She wore black clothing for much of the rest of her life. History often works transformed her world. Chapter 19. A reminder that history's happiest marriages often leave the deepest grief interrupted by tragedy. Chapter 24. After so many unhappy marriages, the lesson hidden in history is pausing for a relationship that actually seems to have contained genuine affection. Queens, emperors, not because it ended happily. One conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. Human nature changes. Married Anne of Bohemia and 1382 changes. Initially, the technology many English nobles disliked the match. The castles become palaces. The alliance offered fewer political advantages than expected. Critics remain people. Commentators seek affection. As commentators have done throughout history, they struggle with expectations. Yet Richard and Anne appear to have developed real affection for one another. They make mistakes. Contemporary accounts suggest the surprisingly warm possessed armies, fortunes, and often acted as a calming influence. Yet many face the same emotional challenges experienced by ordinary people. On behalf of people seeking mercy. The difference was scale. For a time, when their marriages seemed unusually successful. When their arguments escalated, nations sometimes died suddenly during an epidemic. When their relationships failed, entire dynasties was devastated. And perhaps that's what makes these stories so fascinating. Became overwhelming. Behind every crown where she died was reportedly demolished. Behind every throne was a memory. And behind every detail history's greatest events was a marriage that wasn't nearly as happy as official portraits. Richard never fully recovered. His reign became increasingly unstable afterward. Political conflicts intensified. Support weakened. Eventually he lost his throne. It's impossible to know exactly how events might have unfolded had he survived. But many historians believe her death removed one of the few stabilizing influences in Richard's life. Sometimes the most miserable marriages are not the ones filled with conflict. Sometimes they're the ones cut short by loss. Chapter 20. Philip IV and Joan of Navarre, suspicion at the heart of power. King Philip IV of France was known for many things. Warmth and friendliness were not usually among them. He was intelligent, calculating, and intensely focused on authority. His marriage to Joan of Navarre was politically successful. Together they expanded influence and strengthened royal power. Yet the atmosphere surrounding the French court often felt tense. Philip trusted few people. He governed through discipline and control. His family became deeply entangled in political scandals. Most famously, accusations later emerged involving several royal daughters-in-law. The resulting investigations damaged the reputation of the royal family. Although Joan herself generally escaped the worst controversies, the environment surrounding the marriage reflected a broader problem. Life at court increasingly revolved around suspicion. And suspicion is rarely healthy for any relationship. Whether in a medieval palace or a modern apartment, the scale simply changes. Chapter 21. Ivan the Terrible's later marriages, searching for stability and finding none. Earlier we discussed Ivan the Terrible and his beloved first wife, Anastasia. Tonight we return to Ivan. Because after Anastasia's death, his marital history became increasingly chaotic. Ivan married multiple times afterward. Each marriage appeared to begin with hope. Each eventually encountered difficulties. Some wives died unexpectedly. Others were removed from court. Political concerns constantly influenced personal decisions. Meanwhile, Ivan's own mental and emotional state deteriorated. Paranoia increased. Trust disappeared. Fear dominated decision-making. The tragedy is obvious. The stability he had once enjoyed vanished. And no subsequent marriage managed to replace it. For Ivan, every new relationship seems to have reminded him of what he had lost. History remembers him as a powerful ruler. But power offered little protection against grief. Chapter 22. The marriage of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. If two people can spend decades married while barely appearing to enjoy each other's company, Louis XIII of France and Anne of Austria deserve recognition. Their marriage began in 1615. Both were young. Both were members of powerful royal families. Both faced enormous expectations. The problem was that they struggled to connect. Louis was reserved and cautious. Anne was lively and sociable. Misunderstandings emerged almost immediately. Years passed without producing an heir. This became a major political concern. Courtiers speculated endlessly. Rumors spread through Europe. Diplomats monitored developments.